The concept of plot armor is both one of the most common talking points for fictional stories and also one of the most misused terms when it comes to criticism. It actually drives me a little crazy seeing how often it's misused, and so I wanted to make this video to discuss how we can actually define plot armor, then what it is and what it isn't, with examples on both sides. Normally I use a few different characters and series for my examples, but today we'll be pulling examples only from the Game of Thrones TV show, as it has good examples of both good and bad cases of plot armor. The main problem I see with discussions around plot armor is that it has morphed from a genuine criticism of poor writing to a term that's thrown around whenever a character survives or succeeds in any situation where the odds are stacked against them. And it's especially frustrating because it usually ends up completely shutting down any opportunity for further discussion. It's just, this is plot armor, and that's it, the discussion is over. So, I hear you ask, what actually is plot armor then? Well, let's first discuss what it isn't. Plot armor isn't when a character survives or succeeds against the odds. When a character doesn't act 100% rationally or logically in a given situation. When a character is especially or uniquely gifted. The first point is one I kind of mentioned in the introduction, that anytime a character gets lucky, so to speak, people claim it's plot armor. Now, let's get meta for a moment and acknowledge that for every fictional story we engage with, on some level, we as the audience are suspending our disbelief, at least to some extent, and we do this to engage with the wider narrative, and the skill of the author is to then create larger-than-life plots and characters, sometimes in wildly fantastical settings, without pushing our suspension of disbelief too far. And this is something like an unspoken agreement between the author and the audience. However, I feel like modern audiences are too quick to break this agreement and will often cry foul at the first sign of a character getting lucky. But the reality is that in real life, unlikely things happen all the time. Let's write a character together. In our story, our character will be a victim of a plane crash. So while flying, her plane will be struck by lightning and she will fall, let's say, 3 kilometers from the sky. Our character will be the sole survivor of the crash, falling that entire distance, but we'll say she lands in a rainforest and the tree canopy cushions her fall. And then to make it even more exciting, we'll have her survive for 2 weeks in the rainforest alone, before being rescued by a group of hikers. Now, you may say the story is absolutely ridiculous, and that our character clearly has unbelievable amounts of plot armor. But what you may not have known is this is actually the true story of a girl called Julian. Now, I'm not saying you should now have all of your characters surviving 3-kilometer drops from the sky, but the point I'm making is that just because somebody gets lucky in 1 or 2 occasions does not automatically mean that they have plot armor. Remember, we're reading the story of somebody who is the main character because they survive. Let's say 2 identical twins go to battle. One of them wants to open a bakery and the other one wants to become a blacksmith. The twin who wants to be the blacksmith dies, and so we have a story about a man who opens a bakery. It's not plot armor that he survived the battle, but we have a story about a man running a bakery because he's the one who survived. The challenge for writers lies in balancing extraordinary events with believable character development and consistent narrative logic, which we'll talk about more in just a moment. Now, I've spent a bit longer on the first point than I thought, so let's quickly tackle the other 2. The second point is when characters don't act with 100% rationality or logic. I see this a lot, and really the point I want to make here is that people aren't robots. When we create characters, we're, hopefully, creating them with their own personalities, flaws, traits, and tendencies. And more often than not, they're in high-pressure, tense situations where they need to make dramatic, life-changing decisions on the fly. It's very different compared to the reader or viewer, who is able to sit calmly with the benefit of additional knowledge and reason out the optimal option to take. So long as that decision is in line with the character's established motivations and personalities, then this isn't plot armor. And the final point here is about characters being uniquely talented. I see this brought up a lot less, but it's still worth mentioning that, just like in real life, some people are born with natural talents that can give them what might be seen as an unfair advantage in physical or mental competitions. So a character picking up things quicker than others, or doing more with less than someone else, isn't plot armor. It's just a reflection of the reality that is, people are not equal in all aspects. I've been getting more into chess recently, but even if I played non-stop for the next decade and did nothing else, I still doubt I'd be able to take on the world champion Magnus Carlsen. So now we've spoken about what plot armor isn't, let's define what it is. I wanted to be able to summarize it in a single line, so after thinking it over for a bit, I think I've got a definition that I'm happy with. So, plot armor is when something happens in a story which breaks the established rules or conventions of the world, or contradicts previously established characterization with no prior foreshadowing or reasonable explanation. The key takeaway here is that plot armor breaks something that was previously established, and this is most commonly when characters survive or succeed in ways that should be impossible within the story's established framework. And what I mean by this is every world has some kind of internal logic which the characters have to abide by. For example, in a world where humans die if they fall more than 20 feet, if the hero falls 25 feet and survives, that would be plot armor. And characters also have their own internal logic. If a character who is a ruthless killer murders everybody he sees, but then spares the main character when they meet, that would also be an example of plot armor. Authors need to adhere to their own rules and character developments, and deviations from these established norms break the trust of the readers or viewers and erode the integrity of the narrative. It's like pulling back the curtain of a magic trick. We want to believe in the story we're engaged with. We don't want to see how the trick is done. Again, I've spoken a bit longer than I expected to here, but I think it's really important to establish what exactly are the rules around plot armor, so we can have a proper context for the discussion. So now let's move on to a few examples from Game of Thrones. And fair warning here, there are obviously spoilers for the TV show ahead. We'll be going through 2 examples of good writing without plot armor, and then 2 examples of bad writing. So let's jump right in with the good examples, starting with Ned Stark. I went with this example because it's the first really big shocking moment of the series, and probably the moment where a lot of fans realised that this wouldn't be your run-of-the-mill fantasy show. So as a quick recap, after Robert Baratheon, the king, dies, the Lannisters proclaim Joffrey as the new king. Ned, knowing that Joffrey is not the true heir, wants to stop his ascension and invite Stannis, who is the rightful heir, to take the throne. He attempts a forceful power grab, but is betrayed by Littlefinger, imprisoned, and then eventually executed after being forced to make a false public confession. The reason this is good writing is because the villains don't have plot armor. Instead, we are able to follow along with a clear cause and effect chain rooted in Ned's established character traits. Let's run down the key decisions that led to Ned's downfall. Number 1, approaching Cersei to let her know of his intentions in advance. Number 2, not telling Robert the truth while he was still alive. Number 3, declining Renly's offer of support and men. And 4th, trusting Littlefinger to secure the support of the City Watch. Now, you can say, as I've seen many fans do, that Ned was foolish, he was naive, he made bad decisions, or whatever else. But the most important thing here is that they are all in line with his characterization, which has been built up across the entire first season. The 2 most relevant traits here being that firstly, he's incredibly straightforward and honourable by Westerosi standards, believing that doing the right thing is more important even than his own personal safety, and even when that option is by far the hardest. His strict moral code is a fundamental part of his character. And secondly, his almost pathological aversion to harming children, due to what happened to the child Targaryens during the sack of King's Landing. Ned's reluctance to endanger Cersei's children significantly influenced his actions. And as you'll have seen if you're watching the video, I'll flash up a few quotes relevant to Ned. When we look back, it seems so obvious that Ned made mistakes, but importantly we understand why he made those mistakes, and that's where the strength of the writing lies. Everything is in keeping with his established character, and this makes his fate both more shocking and more believable. Let's move on to our second example, Viserys Targaryen. I was going to talk about the Red Wedding, but I think it'll be nice to talk about a non-Stark character. And this is another really good example of a character's own actions leading to their eventual downfall. Again, relying on established traits and decisions. So again, let's quickly recap. Viserys and the rest of the Dothraki arrive at the holy city of Vaes Dothrak, where no blood is permitted to be shed. Viserys, sick of waiting, intoxicated and furious, threatens the pregnant Daenerys in front of Khal Drogo, and draws his blade after being humiliated, a taboo action in the holy city. After believing Khal Drogo has agreed to give him what he wants, he lowers his sword and is summarily executed in a pretty gruesome way. Very fitting of the Dothraki. This is very similar to Ned Stark. Let's run down the poor decisions he made. Firstly, choosing to accompany the Dothraki rather than waiting safely in Illyrio's palace. Secondly, instead of waiting patiently, he becomes increasingly bitter and angry at Khal Drogo's perceived failure to fulfill his promise. Thirdly, he gets extremely drunk in the holy city of the Dothraki, which definitely played a part in clouding his judgment. Finally, he draws his blade in front of 5,000 Dothraki in their holy city and threatens their leader and his pregnant bride. Again, if you're watching the video, you'll see me flashing up a few relevant quotes from this passage. Just like with Ned, this moment is the culmination of Viserys' characterization that we see across the first season, and we can see how one bad decision leads to the next, compounding on each other, until finally the moment of his final consequence arrives. The sequence of events aligns perfectly with Viserys' established character traits. His entitlement, believing in his natural right to the throne of Westeros, his impatience, unable to wait on Khal Drogo, his disrespect for other cultures, disregarding the Dothraki customs, and his arrogance, his inflated sense of self-importance. In both cases of Ned and Viserys, we see them suffer the consequences of their own decisions and actions undertaken in the series, and importantly, the consequences are meaningful and have long-lasting impact, not only on themselves, but on other characters in the series. Both these scenarios also demonstrate how effective storytelling can create dramatic and shocking moments that arise organically from character decisions and established world rules, rather than from arbitrary plot twists or Deus Ex Machina interventions. Let's now turn to our two bad examples, which are sadly from the same series, although later on. The first example is Arya surviving the waif. Now, I feel slightly embarrassed to be using this example because of how bad it is, but again, let's recap what happens. So Arya is effectively ambushed by the waif assassin, who is disguised as an old woman. She is then stabbed multiple times in the gut in quick succession, but then escapes by jumping into the water below and swimming away. She is treated by Lady Crane, but then is confronted by the waif again and runs on foot through the city, before being eventually cornered and defeating the waif off-screen. This sequence of events violates some of our key rules around plot armor, breaking established conventions of the world, and breaking our suspension of disbelief. The internal logic of the Game of Thrones world, shown to us up to this point, is that injuries are typically treated realistically and have lasting consequences. We can point to a few examples from earlier in the series to illustrate this, like Khal Drogo's slash wound to the torso becoming infected and leading to his eventual death, and then Talisa being stabbed in a similar fashion to Arya during the Red Wedding and seemingly dying instantly as we see Robb Stark cradle her, and even Ned Stark being impaled by a Lannister soldier in the leg, then walking with a limp for the rest of the season. By contrast, Arya has enough energy to both run and swim away from the assassin. She is patched up by Lady Crane, an actress with no medical training who claims to have learnt to treat wounds because she would stab her boyfriends after they cheated on her and then, quote, patch them up. And note that Arya's wounds aren't superficial. She has been stabbed multiple times in the abdomen, which may have also ruptured internal organs such as her intestines, and she's been swimming through potentially dirty city water, exposing herself to infection. She is then shown to be fit enough the next day to run through the city, performing athletic feats of sliding and jumping, despite being severely wounded the previous day, and then even killing the waif off screen. After she kills the waif, her wounds are never shown or mentioned again. This example really highlights how plot armor can damage narrative credibility. by artificially preserving Arya's life and abilities in a way that contradicts the established rules of the world, what the writers are doing is they're undermining the sense of danger and realism that really was the hallmark of the series. I'm not surprised that Arya defeated the waif off-screen, because I think it would have been difficult to see how a severely wounded Arya could overcome a trained assassin. Let's now move on to our final example, which is Cersei retaining power after blowing up the Sept of Baelor. So again, let's do a quick recap. After being publicly disgraced by the church and being exposed for multiple serious crimes such as adultery, murder and regicide, Cersei blows up the Sept of Baelor using wildfire, killing all of her political opponents in one fell swoop. And after this, she assumes absolute control of the crown and of King's Landing. Now, the problem here is less the scene itself, because I can actually see Cersei doing something crazy like this, and more the fact that she faces no consequences as a result of this. Let's run down some of the implications of her actions that were completely glossed over. So firstly, one of her victims was Kevan Lannister, her uncle, which really should have alienated Cersei from her own house. Secondly, Tommen, her son, commits suicide, meaning she has no legitimate claim to the throne of Westeros. Thirdly, she kills all the senior nobility and leaders of the Tyrell family, who were the Lords of the Reach, and this really should have resulted in an uprising from them or some kind of response. Remember what happened when just Ned Stark alone was executed in the first season, and Robb Stark led a rebellion as a result of that? This is significantly worse, and not to mention that Cersei is really unpopular at this point, has just been publicly shamed through the Walk of Shame, and the Tyrells are much more popular than her. And finally, she murders the High Sparrow, the head of the Church of the Seven, who is also very popular with the commoners, so this should really result in outrage and unrest amongst the common people. Remember what happened in Season 2 when there were food shortages in the capital, and it resulted in a riot? Not to mention that the Faith were recently militarizing through the Faith Militant, and it's likely there are still members of this group left. As I've been saying with these examples, Game of Thrones is, or at least was, a show built on the idea of character decisions having meaningful, impactful consequences. But at this point in the show with Cersei, this concept is completely thrown out of the window. I mean, she's committed all of the worst sins imaginable: kingslaying, kinslaying, mass murder, desecration of a sept, the list goes on. There really should be, at a minimum, an angry mob pounding on the gates of the castle, demanding her removal or execution. The real-life equivalent would be a king in medieval times, murdering the Pope, blowing up the Vatican, killing their uncle and the previous queen, and taking out half the nobility of their country at the same time. Such an event is unprecedented in history, and for good reason. Now that we've spent some time talking about plot armor and going through our different examples, let's round off the discussion. Plot armor is not simply characters surviving against the odds, making irrational decisions, or possessing unique talents. These elements, when consistent with established character traits and world rules, are actually what make up a rich and engaging narrative. What plot armor actually is, in short, is when something happens in a story that breaks the internal logic or established rules of either the characters or the world they're in. When the writing is done well, it leads to well-crafted narratives where characters experience the consequences of their actions and decisions as a direct result of their established traits. When done badly, however, it breaks our suspension of disbelief and undermines the credibility of the story, exposing us to the fake nature of the world. The key to avoiding plot armor basically lies in maintaining consistency with character traits, world rules, and consequences. What we want from our stories is for our characters' fates, whether triumphant or tragic, to arise organically and not as a result of clumsy, overt writer intervention. And with that, we have arrived at the end of the video. So, thank you for watching, and as always, I'm interested to hear what you guys think. So definitely leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and I'll always do my best to reply to you. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more, please do like and subscribe, as it does help me out. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.